Who is Marvel's most hated character? Hey, Paul! Ah! It's obviously Paul. Paul is by far the most hated. But for a while, it was Riri Williams. And with the Ironheart show now about to drop, anti-Riri mania is at an all-time high.
A TV show commissioned 5 years ago when the whole let's swap out beloved legacy characters for diverse new alternatives craze was at its obnoxious peak in the MCU.
I'm gonna get to the rest of what he said in a second, but Drinker, are you seriously saying that She-Hulk and the Wasp, characters who have existed since the 60s and 70s, are new characters?
Let's swap out beloved legacy characters for diverse new alternatives.
Come on, man. Riri Williams is not the first legacy character to try filling in for Tony Stark. Hell, she isn't even the first black character to do so. But when she debuted back in 2017, she became a lightning rod for controversy. This was an era where all of Marvel's three core characters, Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor, were temporarily retired by Marvel and replaced with a new legacy character. Oh, and by the way, when I say core character, I mean circa the mid-2010s, like Spider-Man, Wolverine, obviously more popular, but, I digress. I'm getting sidetracked. Sam Wilson replaced Captain America, Jane Foster replaced Thor, and Riri Williams replaced Tony Stark. But while Sam and Jane were more fondly remembered today, people still cannot stand Riri. Sam and Jane are still included on merchandise and comic books today. Riri, not so much. Now, I do think there are a few reasons why Riri was so hated, and some are obvious. So, for one, Thor and Steve Rogers didn't exactly die. Thor was deemed unworthy to wield Mjolnir, while Steve was rapidly aged into an old man. But Tony, at this point in time, he was in a coma after fighting Carol Danvers at the climax of Civil War Part 2. One of Marvel's, most events of all time, I'd say. But I gotta say, if you actually believed any of these three replacements were permanent... So listen, I know this Nigerian prince who's trying to look for investors for a monorail he's building.
Monorail!
We had just been through this a couple years prior with Superior Spider-Man, where the 616 Spider-Man absolutely for sure was killed and replaced by Doc Ock. Never coming back, this is the permanent status quo now, only for a year later for Peter Parker to get better and reclaim his body and all that. And before that, Batman was seemingly killed off at the end of Final Crisis, at the hands of Darkseid. And Dick Grayson, after fighting for the cowl against Jason Todd, became the new Batman, only for Bruce to return. But Iron Man, though, he was effectively dead, albeit survived by an AI which had all of his memories, personality, talked like him, acted like him, consciousness was the same, all that, so essentially just Iron Man, but in a computer. But the other big difference, too, Jane Foster and Sam Wilson had long established histories with their respective heroes before replacing them. Jane Foster was Thor's girlfriend, Sam was his wingman, but Riri was created in the lead up to Civil War Part 2, established as a replacement for Iron Man from the very get-go, and that made Riri feel artificial, tangential, added. But the character didn't become a lightning rod for controversy until after she replaced Iron Man in his main title book, officially after Civil War Part 2. She became a poster child for Marvel's failures as a company, or at least supposed failures. See, the idea of diversity was still just as big a lightning rod for controversy 10 years ago as it is now. So the idea that Iron Man, a white male billionaire, was being replaced by a poor black girl felt like the personification of replacement theory.
Replacement theory is the idea that white populations, both in North America, here in the USA, and in Europe, are being replaced by minority populations, largely through immigration.
But Riri did replace Tony Stark. Not War Machine, not Pepper Potts. Hell, at this point, Mary Jane Watson honestly was in a position where she could have replaced Tony quite well, given that she was now in charge of Stark Industries. But Marvel had other plans for Mary Jane, like making her Venom a decade later. And Paul. Hey, Paul! I will never get over you, Paul. Riri just felt very shoed in as a legacy character, in a story that had multiple other candidates for a legacy character in the first place. Hell, even Doctor Doom was in a better position to replace Iron Man, given that Iron Man had been meddling around with Latveria in Bendis' Invincible Iron Man title previously. See, this might be surprising. This is not a video where I defend Riri Williams. The character has some serious problems, but rather, it's a video where I address the big reasons why people hate her, some legitimate, some not so much, and the actual reasons I think Riri just didn't work. Brian Michael Bendis created Riri Williams, and writers later on, such as Ewing, tried to fix the problems that Bendis created for Riri. But by the time they got to Riri, the damage was done. Ironheart was damaged goods based purely on Brian Michael Bendis' horrendous run on Invincible Iron Man that introduced Riri. Bringing her forward in the worst possible way, that's just set up for failure. Continuous failure. It didn't matter how many writers came in to fix it, the damage was done. To figure out how this happened, however, I had to do something that a lot of people are afraid of doing themselves when talking about Riri Williams. Actually reading the comics in which she appears in. I know, shocker. Reading the comics actually tells you why Ironheart didn't work as a character. A few key players you gotta know at the beginning here. Tomo, she is this inhuman who can control metal, and she's relevant in many of Riri's early stories because she's one of the first real threatening roles that Riri faced, as well as Latveria, apparently. Now, Tony fought Tomo and fought in Latveria prior to Civil War Part 2, but these storylines involving this metal-controlling inhuman and the leadership of Latveria carried over into Riri's story, so she was saddled with Tony Stark's leftovers, so to speak. Tomo is basically the Raditz in this story, so don't put too much thought into her story. She's not as important.
He was so weak, we could actually grow Raditzes!
She's more like the first test boss that actually challenges Riri in some way. And in my opinion, the way she deals with the conflict indicates all the problems with Ironheart as a character under Bendis, but we'll get to that bridge when we cross it. Riri is a 15-year-old girl who got into MIT on scholarship as a preteen due to her being a super genius, who reverse engineered an Iron Man suit in order to make her own Iron Man suit, essentially. At this point, it was believed Tony might be really dead due to a lot of different things going on, as you do. So Riri felt she was destined to make her own suit out of stolen scraps from her college campus. But she runs away from campus after being seen, only for Tony to end up learning about her, visiting her in her Chicago home, and immediately becoming impressed by her young talents. I should note that this happens in the margins of multiple other storylines already going on, including, Civil War Part 2. To say it feels completely disconnected from everything else is an understatement. Now, why is Riri Williams so hated? Aside from her name being hard to say, which I am not going to let go. It's really hard to say this a lot, okay? I'm taking a lot of takes of this and keep stumbling over my own stuttering over it. There's a lot of commentary on Riri and Ironheart as a character. Some of it good, some of it bad. And because even credible comic book critics had issues with Ironheart as a character. She didn't work. This isn't just grifters online saying it. This is a lot of people with legitimate backgrounds in comic criticism and comic journalism who just couldn't mesh with this character. For example, friend of the channel Comic Drake made a few different videos about Riri a few years apart, reflecting on his developing feelings on the character and why she just never clicked for him.
I have no idea how any editor could have looked at this and say, wow, Brian, this script about a little black girl begging to be oppressed is really, really good. Also, before settling on the name Ironheart, did nobody at Marvel think it might be a good idea to do a quick Google search? Because some very interesting results would have popped up.
Also, I swear I didn't watch his video before scripting this, but we had very similar introductory statements. I just think it's really funny.
And you know what? I am not a fan of Ironheart. I think that she is aggressively mid. I don't like her because I read the book and formed my own opinion. A wild concept, I know.
Now, Comics by Perch also dropped a video prior to the release of Black Panther 2 that I thought was very insightful about why Riri didn't work, where he suspects that Ironheart was just the biggest example of many abrupt changes made to Marvel during the 2010s. Marvel replaced the X-Men with the Inhumans. There were other characters who got replaced. Again, I mentioned before, both Cap and Thor were replaced by different counterparts. Even Miles Morales and Kamala Khan, two characters who were, for the most part, pretty well liked today, were controversial when first announced because they were these new diverse heroes meant to replace the old white heroes. And I'm not saying necessarily this is a racism thing, but I am saying that it was a lot of change. The face of Marvel was rapidly changing day to day to day, week to week to week, so some readers had a hard time grasping with that. Not even in a racial way, but simply like, oh, these characters I loved, now they're gone. Or these characters I knew, in the case of Carol Danvers, now they're missed, now they're pushed to the wayside in favor of new characters. It just so happened that many of these characters were diverse, so that also allowed other people who were racist to kind of take hold of that conversation, to say, oh hey, it's not simply that the things you're familiar with are going away, it's the things you're familiar with are being replaced by black people.
Black is your shield and woman is your sword.
I apologize to both Comic Drake and Perch for putting them in the same video as your boy Zach.
What are your thoughts on the current state of comic books?
Comics are kind of weirdly dying politics, specifically identity politics being shoved into everything. Ms. Marvel was introduced as a Pakistani-American Muslim, Riri Williams, who replaced Iron Man. If you don't like her, it's because you're racist or sexist, but probably both.
It would upset a racist.
I think it would.
Richard C. Meyer is a terrible critic. He is a grifter. There's no ambiguity about it. He's one of the founding members of Comicsgate, a movement that he was quickly outmaneuvered in by other grifters more skilled and talented than him, like Eric July and Ethan Van Sciver, who have experience in content creation, while Richard C. Meyer just rambled in his car about comics, just consistently.
We, of course, are rocking those A cups. Anything above a B cup, you hate women.
I'll be blunt, I think Meyer's a moron. Like, he's an idiot. Most of Meyer's criticisms are deeply superficial, if not completely flawed and foolish, essentially.
Hi, everyone. So last night I did a video about Riri Williams and how the only way to really save her is by making her into a villain.
He concluded that Riri was written as the wrong character. You see, his conclusion was that Riri should be a villain because she stole the role of Iron Man from Tony, despite Tony at the beginning praising her and thinking she was a brilliant engineer that he would want to take under his wing, and despite the fact that Tony was in a coma and reclaimed Iron Man right after getting out of the coma, and that had nothing to do with Riri, that was entirely Carol Danvers. And, you know, she's not really a villain. But we're going to see really that the big issue is that first run by Bendis. It was so toxic, it poisoned the well from there moving forward. Riri's first arc as Ironheart takes place in the Invincible Iron Man Volume 4, the first 11 or so issues. Here, Riri is introduced as a new hero, who quickly becomes widely regarded by the press and public, etc. She ends up being courted by Stark Industries, S.H.I.E.L.D., her old school MIT, and the Champions, to be a new hero/engineer on payroll. She also fights Tomo, an Inhuman who Tony was fighting in the prior arc of the Invincible Iron Man story, also by Bendis, and Lucia von Bardas, a warlord trying to take over Latveria. Ironheart fights Lucia because S.H.I.E.L.D., under the leadership of Sharon Carter, asks her to. Ironheart then, after beating Lucia, declares herself the new leader of Latveria in order to broker a truce between S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Latverian armies. Now, do you notice something missing from that description just now? That's right, not once did I mention what Riri wanted, felt, or thought throughout this entire arc, because it doesn't matter. And that's one of the big issues with how Bendis wrote Riri. He didn't care what made Riri tick. He cared about the role Riri filled as Ironheart, and very little else. Riri was a role before becoming a character. In the original Bendis run of Invincible Iron Man, Riri is depicted as a super intelligent young girl whose intelligence is framed as a curse. She's socially cut off from her peers, with even her stepfather being profoundly uncomfortable by her presence. In some ways, her building suits and tech is an outlet for her intelligence and boredom. However, after the loss of her childhood best friend and her stepfather in the first issue from a drive-by shooter, it's established that she has very little control over her environment, and so tries to cement her control. A common criticism of characters like Ironheart, who replace established heroes, is that they're just perfect, despite having no training at all. And Ironheart isn't perfect at all, actually. The first issue shows Riri struggling to beat up a villain with very few superpowers. She spawns monsters, but one punch to the head's all it takes to knock her down and beat all the monsters. Very simple solution. Anyone can do that with super strength, but Riri struggles against that. There's a scene where Iron Man's Iron Legion is training with Riri, and they're all coming at her at once, and she's just getting punched from all sides. She can't do anything about it. Her only solution is to run away, stall for time, and install a virus into the Iron Legion that shuts them all down. She can't outmaneuver them, she can't outfight them, she can just run away and take advantage of people underestimating her until she uploads a virus. By the way, this is also how she beats Tomo, with a lot of help from Pepper Potts. And the problem with that is it only works with technologically based supervillains. Running away and uploading a virus to an organic threat is not going to do anything. You see the problem already? Riri was pitted against very specific enemies early on that were easy for her skill set to deal with. Like, yeah, sure, she is a technological genius, undeniably, no question about it, but she lacks combat sense, which is important when you're a superhero. She's got wits outside the suit, but she doesn't have any skills. This is unlike, say, Miles Morales, Kamala Khan, the new Nova, because they actually can fight and have superpowers that they have to use creatively to solve problems. Riri has only a couple solutions. A Mega Punch, computer virus. And that's basically it for the entire Bendis run, essentially. She only fights opponents she has a chance at beating. And other confrontations that she might have that are outside that specific lens of her particular skill set, it's glossed over. We don't really see how she wins. There's a panel where she fights the Rhino, who's one of the strongest villains Spider-Man faces, and she just sort of wins off screen. Now, in the case of Tomo and the Iron Legion, Riri just evades the fight long enough to install a virus. But how does she beat the Rhino? Does she just punch him really hard? Well, Spider-Man can't just punch the Rhino really hard. He's got to use his skill, his brain. How does Riri, a genius, combat the Rhino, a guy who's all physical strength and not much up here? There's got to be a way that's clever and interesting, but we don't see that. And that's disappointing. We're just meant to take away that Ironheart is this incredibly powerful superhero and he can just do anything she wants, but we're not given a sense of, okay, how does she use her brain to fight people outside her particular skill set? How does she grow? And we see one fight later on with Will-o'-the-Wisp that's interesting. I'll get to that a little later, but we don't get a sense of, early on especially, how Ironheart is growing as a hero, because she just uses the same tactics every time for the first 9 or 10 issues, until we get to Latveria, basically. And even then, the way she resolves the Latveria subplot is again very disappointing as well. Issue 7, Ironheart gets her ass handed to her by Will-o'-the-Wisp, of all villains. The first time she fights someone who is an opponent who won't succumb to a computer virus and can easily take a Mega Punch, Ironheart's down fast. This also begs the question how she beat the Rhino, but who knows. So we see Ironheart struggle. We see her beaten, and she's beaten easily. And this establishes something to us really quickly. Ironheart has only succeeded because she's in a very specific niche that her skills flourish in. Outside that niche, she's ineffective. She can't do anything. And I think that's interesting because they never challenge her again in this run. She's never put in a position again where she is challenged to such an extent. We think she is, but it's still in her skill set otherwise. But another major problem that I've alluded to, Riri's personality is very flawed. She retreats when things are not going her way. She's often cold. She's not socially adept, has very few friends, and not in the way that Kamala Khan or Peter Parker are, where their awkwardness is charming. Riri's social awkwardness is off-putting, genuinely so, especially under Bendis' writing, where the awkwardness is not balanced out by humanity like it is in Eve Ewing's run. She responds to tragedies like her stepdad dying with a detached observation. That's how she processes it. Yes, it's clearly a coping mechanism, but that doesn't make Riri likable to the reader, especially when her expressions are non-expressive. Again, this is one of the reasons why I think that Riri reads as autistic. She has emotions, she has feelings, but she has a hard time expressing them. And because the writing doesn't give you details to indicate how she's feeling internally, you're left with the external, which is where most of the other adult characters are. And many of the adult characters feel uncomfortable around Riri because she doesn't open up emotionally to them. But as a writer, Bendis refuses to engage with Riri's character on the internal, and as a result, you're left with just a sense of something missing. In many ways, this is similar to Tony Stark. Tony Stark has a lot of antisocial coping mechanisms for trauma and stress in his life, like alcoholism. But the problem is, we see the internal mechanisms of Tony Stark's personality. We don't see that with Riri. We don't see how her brain works internally. We just see the external. Making this even worse is that most of the external that we have for her isn't even from her originally. It's from some other external character, an adult giving Riri parts of her identity. Her identity is Ironheart. Tony Stark thinks of that for her first. Most of what Riri is given to her by someone else. And there is some cringe dialogue that's reflective of Bendis' very on-the-nose style, but it has less to do with Riri and more to do with the characters around Ironheart who talk to her, especially the Tony Stark AI. Their dialogue turns what could be subtext into blaring obvious text, and it's the only chance we get to see how Ironheart sees the world. And unfortunately, Bendis does a bad job writing for a teenage girl and how they typically talk, even one who is astutely obsessed with engineering and programming. It comes across as artificial. It comes across as a mouthpiece for ideas rather than a teenage girl organically discussing ideas. I do not think it works because you never get a sense of Ironheart as a kid. She's just an engineer. Had you written Ironheart as an adult, there'd be nothing different. And yes, I understand that they wrote her early on as a super genius who is born a genius and will mature faster than everyone else, but she's still a kid. You have to remember that. She is still a child. And Bendis fails to communicate the childlike elements of her character. Even the fact that she references Tron, an 80s film, as like pop culture, he doesn't really do anything with that. It's more like, oh hey, Tony Stark and her can bounce off pop culture references, but she only knows Tron and she doesn't know Freaks or Geeks or anything else. It's kind of weird. Why would you open that door up to a character trait and not explore what it means about her personal life, her inner workings? Look, Ironheart doesn't have a charming personality. She's cold, off-putting. But again, so is the Punisher. So is Rorschach. So is the Question. We gotta get over this because superheroes can be arrogant and interesting. So why isn't Ironheart compelling? Well, for one, it's that Ironheart replaced Iron Man, who is nothing if not compelling and affable.
I saw young Americans killed by the very weapons I created to defend them and protect them.
The problem is Riri, despite never showing any thoughts on the global political landscape, will then just dive into rants about S.H.I.E.L.D. at the drop of a hat. It's not that anything she's saying is necessarily wrong, even if it feels essay-like in comparison to Bendis' ordinarily choppy dialogue, but that these speeches are just our introduction to Riri's political thoughts. And it's written like it's the culmination of all the thoughts she's had up until this point in the story. As a result, it feels abrupt and unsatisfying, like an afterthought given extra time to make an impression, like this was something built up but all the build-up was left out. It doesn't feel sincere. It feels tacked on, especially when compared to Ms. Marvel, a contemporary book that also tackled political themes of discrimination and identity in a way that layered the ideas throughout. It was developed, not, and I hate to use this term, forced into the dialogue. 1,000 words are used to communicate what should have been said in 10. And what makes the S.H.I.E.L.D. thing so strange is we later learn in the 7th issue that Riri is supposedly apolitical. She watches talk shows on the left and the right simultaneously. She doesn't have any political allegiance, according to S.H.I.E.L.D. examinations. So, which is it? Are you taking a major political stand, or are you not? Also, considering that Ironheart ends up brokering peace talks with S.H.I.E.L.D. and Latveria, you know she conquered an entire nation. She might be a little more politically inclined than she at first seems to appear. And yet, everyone fawns over her like she's something very special. And it feels artificial. It feels like we're being told from people who are experienced in the superhero world that she's a big deal. And that's the takeaway a lot of people have, that the story has all these characters fawning over her, and it feels artificial. Are the characters fawning over Riri? Yeah, maybe. They're nice to her, or deeply put off by her. That's the two modes they're at. But there's very little middle ground there. And you kind of start reading into why they're fawning over her and complimenting her so much. Mary Jane and Pepper give Riri this big lab in issue 6, right? And a lot of people might read this as everyone being just Riri's best friend, loving Ironheart. But MJ points out something here that really made me reevaluate what everyone was saying with this comic. Mary Jane needs to run Stark Industries right now. Pepper is out there fighting real villains. She's the one who fended off Tomo and her Iron Army long enough for Riri to upload a virus. The fight with Tomo is more Pepper's victory than Riri's. Riri has proven herself as an engineer. So she's given an engineering job. She's basically building Iron Man suits for herself, sure, but as Mary Jane and Pepper point out, that means she can help Stark Industries keep the world safe. On Stark Industries' term, she's basically an intern. A Stark intern.
Yeah, remember when you applied?
Yeah.
I approved. So now we're in business.
Having a Stark internship.
Anyway, what did I apply for?
That's what I'm here to hash out.
Okay, hash it out. Okay.
See, this also leads to another issue I have too with Riri. In the MCU, everything Riri does in the comics was given to Peter Parker. The fact that the MCU Civil War and Civil War Part 2 happened so close together, it draws a connection. It's inevitable, right? Because in both, Tony Stark takes a particular interest in a gifted and talented youngster who is building incredible tech out of stolen trash, like Riri. The reason MCU Riri is so different is because she'd become Iron Man Jr., like Peter Parker did. Only difference is Spidey is better at fighting than Riri and has to work outside of Stark's tech to establish himself as a hero, and is more charming. Ironheart can't fight. She can only engineer, and everyone wants her to work as an engineer. You have S.H.I.E.L.D., you have Stark, you have MIT, even the Champions show up, who are teens her age. It almost feels like these companies are approaching a teen who is having her first real chance at fame and fortune, and are trying to get her to work for them to better their company. These characters aren't fawning over her, they're grooming her for a position at their company to serve as a company employee. She's not this grand hero. She's being used by other organizations who want to exploit her talents for them. It's not a story of a Mary Sue, it's a story of a girl being exploited by capitalist systems. And look, Stark, MIT, they both want her to produce material that they can use for their own ends, proprietary technology. And maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing that these people are giving her opportunities because she wouldn't have those otherwise. Then again, she was also in MIT as a teenager, so what are you gonna do? Remember, she's a 15-year-old girl. She's overwhelmed by her own popularity. And later on, when S.H.I.E.L.D. is attacked by this Latverian invading force, S.H.I.E.L.D. gets Ironheart to do their dirty work for them. Essentially, using a teenage girl as a weapon to get around legal blocks and all that. That's the thing. She is not a Mary Sue. She's a victim, exploited by powers that may not be as smart as her with engineering skills or programming, but are very savvy with how to use and manipulate people, especially someone as easy to read and easy to manipulate as Riri. This is why I think Richard Meyer's criticisms of Riri being a villain are ridiculous. She's not in control of her story. It's other people who control her narrative. She is just being easily manipulated by the adults in her life, and there's nothing that anyone does to stop it. Because she herself convinces herself that she's in control when she really isn't. But another major problem? None of the characters read like actual people. When reading this run, it struck me how every character only talks about Riri or Tony. Aside from the villains, who occasionally discuss Latveria, they are all focused on Riri or Tony. Even Tony, all he talks about is Riri. And I don't necessarily mean literally every line, but it certainly feels that way, you know what I'm saying? And as a result, the world feels artificial, it feels inauthentic. And I think that most when seeing Miles Morales, a character Bendis created, alongside Kamala Khan, one of Marvel's biggest, youngest personalities, and all of them felt flat when Bendis wrote them in a couple of scenes in the Invincible Iron Man comic. They felt like set dressing. These characters who were beloved felt boring. How do you make Kamala Khan and Miles Morales boring? How do you do that, Bendis? That's a talent. That's a skill, I think. One I don't like, but it's a skill nonetheless. Actually, you know what? Mentioning these two, compare Miles and Kamala's first arcs to Ironheart's. Miles and Kamala became heroes due to circumstances outside their control, and are inspired indirectly by their favorite heroes. The admiration for Spider-Man and Captain Marvel is authentically built up prior to them becoming heroes. With Kamala, her entire early arc is about her realizing that she can't define herself by the expectations of other heroes or by society's expectations of heroes. People forget this, but early on, Kamala's body transforms to look like her hero, Carol Danvers. It's a pretty big deal when she realizes she can be a brown Muslim girl from New Jersey and not Carol to be a worthy hero. And come Civil War Part 2, Kamala and Carol fall out harder, as Carol's flawed reality conflicts with Kamala's hero worship of her. The Champions is a team built from the younger generation's profound disappointment with the prior ones. But of course, there's a few scenes that everyone talks about with Ironheart, and one of them happens in issue 8 of the Invincible Iron Man run. This is the one with the flashback with the teacher. And yeah, this scene is thanks in no small part to Richard C. Meyer's various obsessive videos on Riri Williams, complaining about it when it happened, is what most people associate with the character of Ironheart.
She's basically a sociopath who just randomly decided to be a superhero because like her first grade teacher told her she couldn't be Tony Stark after she asked her specifically to say that. So she stood up in her class and she asked to be oppressed, and finally, after like 2 pages of staring like a psycho, her teacher relented.
Being here talking to her teacher, who is trying to raise her spirits and demanding the teacher tell her that she can't do something because she needs someone telling her she can't do something in order to do it right. And the scene doesn't work, in part because children don't really talk this way. It feels like a grown man putting words in a child's mouth. Even a super genius child, yes, but it feels artificial. It doesn't feel like something that would actually happen. The teacher gets easily frustrated. It just seems like it seems artificial is what I'm getting at. And let's also not ignore the implications of a young black girl demanding an old white woman oppress her, and racially profile her. There's a lot of subtext to that, most of which is pretty obviously screwed up. How did no one read this and think, yeah, there's no bizarre implications about a black person demanding to be racially oppressed? What matters is it undermines the version of Riri Williams we've seen up until this point. Ironheart has expressed discomfort with MIT, Stark Industries, S.H.I.E.L.D., and the Champions trying to recruit her. We saw that abrupt speech she gave with S.H.I.E.L.D. about politics and all that, but hey, Ironheart's apolitical. The problem is, with all of that, is that Ironheart desperately wanted to be challenged. Everything in Ironheart's life comes naturally, and yet she needs something to overcome. Even as a hero, she is coddled after her first loss. But she doesn't have a challenge. See the problem? It's a story without a challenge, with a main character desperately begging to be challenged. And the fact it's played off in this weird scene and not tied in with the actual scenes where she isn't challenged as an adult makes everything feel like it's in conflict with each other. She wants to be challenged in the past, but when she's effortlessly beating villains in the present who are best suited for her skill set, she doesn't have any thoughts on it. When Will-O-the-Wisp beats her, she doesn't have this kind of internal thought, this process that she talks about, this maybe even optimism that someone can challenge her. Like, that's your story. A character who has struggled with challenge is finally beaten, unequivocally beaten, and you gloss over it? You move past it that quickly? Riri makes one token comment about training like astronauts do, and then they immediately switch to the Latveria plot, completely glossing over any possible growth Riri could have in order to get to the next plot point quickly. This is a character who begged her teacher to insist she couldn't become a scientist, and begged for something beyond the scientist that she couldn't do, that would be a challenge for her to reach, that was outside the realm of what anyone else could do. And now she's been beaten, and you don't use that? You gloss over that? You have other characters talk to Riri about surviving being beaten and all that, and you don't address her trying to fight Will-o'-the-Wisp again or anything like that? That's your choice? That's your decision that you make? You avoid discussing the interesting drama in the story to follow through with some Latveria subplot? Because it gets glossed aside when Latveria shows up. She then goes into full conquest of Latveria and all that. For S.H.I.E.L.D., American colonialism, again, apolitical, don't forget that. But that's beside the point. The point is, she could have had a really interesting personal arc with someone who beat her, unequivocally, undeniably stopped her. And she doesn't. They just gloss over it. That's not important to the character. And that's the big issue. There are these elements established throughout the narrative, and none of them connect in a way that's interesting to Riri's internal story. Also, I realize I didn't mention this earlier in the script. At some point, Ironheart just fights Lady Doc Ock. Yeah, it's disappointing, and she gets beaten by Riri tapping her with like an electromagnetic pulse from her fingertip. It's dumb. But let's talk about her conquering Latveria, because this is the second thing everyone talks about, how she declares herself the monarch of Latveria at the end of the story, and then, reluctantly gives up power. But she's clearly doing it to broker peace. Some people read this as Riri being an egomaniac or succumbing to villainy, but come on. It's just to instill a democracy in another country. American colonialism. Hell, I'll even say this, it's the closest we see Riri do something for someone else completely charitably. There is a clear sense that Riri actually cares about the safety of the people of Latveria in these scenes. It's a good humanizing moment, not indicative of any villainy or any secret drive for power, but just a genuine sense of wanting to do good. Like what superheroes do typically. There's a lot you can say about this entire arc, but I think the idea of making a black character who's supposedly very politically aware become basically a Project Ajax insert where she conquers a country to force it to align to her political ideologies is at best unintentionally loaded with American colonialism / problematic Cold War wish fulfillment, and at worst, profoundly screwed up and undermines everything that came before it. Of course, what undermines the level of how this works out is that Latveria quickly fails as a democracy and plunges into a deeper tyranny. One so bad, Dr. Doom has to come in and save it. Dr. Doom had to save Latveria from the democracy that Riri instilled in it. And unintentionally, she didn't mean for that to happen. But to stop it from being a further dictatorship, Dr. Doom has to set in. What does that tell you? I mean, I guess it kind of adds some realism to Ironheart's conquest of Latveria, that it leads to unintentional horror shortly after she leaves, but I digress. But of course, let's not ignore the fact that all of this is according to the design S.H.I.E.L.D. wanted. Sure, Ironheart declares herself a monarch, but she's doing this as a pawn of Sharon Carter, who uses Riri to circumvent the fact that she has no evidence to justify an invasion of Latveria. At every turn, Ironheart is just a pawn for older characters who lack her engineering skills and knowledge and all that, but are completely cunning, all to exploit them for their own benefit. Bendis' run leaves so much clever storytelling on the table, but never uses it. He could have explored the themes of someone trying to take a genius and use them for selfish ends. She could have talked about the conflict between Kamala and Carol in Civil War II, the idea between the idealization of a hero and hero worship versus this disappointing reality of meeting your heroes, and just applied that to Ironheart and Iron Man. But instead, he neglects this. Iron Man is a saint, a martyr. Riri is just a role model, an example to stand in the way. She's given no internal plot, she's given no internal conflict, she isn't even tied in all that much with the external conflict, and the adults around her use her to resolve conflicts that were lingering at the end of the previous Iron Man run Bendis was working on. It's a tragedy, and yet we don't see any of the tragic elements play out. And at the end of it, none of this conflict is personally driven to what defined Ironheart from the start. The need to be challenged, the feeling of helplessness, of seeing things she can't control happen, like the drive-by shooting that kills her stepdad and best friend. Don't forget, that's how the run started, and it barely factors in to anything that follows. It's something Eve Ewing had to pick up in the next Ironheart run and explore that. But that was years after it first happened, which meant Riri had this unresolved, unexplored component of her character. And the Champions discussed it too, I'll get to that in a second. But all the emotional conflict that Ironheart can experience is left ignored completely. In Bendis' run, every character interaction is defined by benefactor and malefactor. Can this person help Ironheart, or can they impede Ironheart? And as a result, Bendis creates a landscape where Ironheart has no need to socially interact with anyone. She's never given interpersonal conflicts. She's given things or impeded, and that's it. Riri does not undergo an arc. She isn't challenged emotionally. That's completely counter to Miles and Kamala, whose arcs are defined by their emotional and social struggles, way more than their external ones. The fact that Kamala Khan doesn't have a real arch enemy is indicative of how she was never really given a good external threat, but she was given so many internal threats, readers kept reading. And all of this, thankfully, is completely undone by the Champions and the Eve Ewing Ironheart run. Riri joins the Champions after the events of Secret Empire, where Steve Rogers' Captain America, it didn't take long for him to come back after being aged up, was replaced by a Hydra doppelganger. So after that, Ironheart figured, time to join a group of heroes, her own age, while she also takes up MIT's offer to give her a lab to perfect her engineering projects. And what happened here is we saw the potential of Ironheart realized, but it was too little, too late. What the Champions showed is Riri is best when put in conflict with peers, not mentors or people who can influence her, but people her own age. Now the Champions run did two things really right. The first thing, Ironheart is no longer the center focus of the story. She wasn't the most important character in the room. Not everyone wanted her to solve their problems right away. No, she was just a character in a larger cast. Hell, she wasn't even the focus in most stories, not with Miles Morales or Kamala Khan there. Now, Riri joined the Champions 16 issues into their run, though again she worked with them during Secret Empire a couple issues prior. Now the second thing is Ironheart had problems outside of the external. She had interpersonal and internal conflict when working with the Champions. There's a scene in Champions issue 24 where Miles learns there's a shooting at his own school. And Riri, who remember, lost her best friend and stepdad to a drive-by shooter, has this grim response, where it seems like she's come to just accept violence as inevitable. They're out-of-control components. Riri admits this lack of control helps motivate her to be Ironheart, to get some control over the uncontrollable, but this doesn't sit well with Miles, who, remember, his school just got shot up, so he's obviously a little emotionally compromised in the whole situation. Riri is still antisocial, but in the Champions books, her antisocial behavior is a source of conflict. It's not glossed over, and, most importantly, she can grow from the events that happen as she's forced to confront how her behavior affects others. Most memorable of the Champions arc is the interaction between Riri and Viv. Viv is the daughter of Vision, a synthezoid with a lot of learning to do about what it means to be human. And over the course of her adventures with the Champions, with Ironheart as a part of the Champions, Viv realizes she's got a crush on Riri, apparently. And so it's here that Riri's put in a position where it's completely outside of her scope of understanding. See, she gets computers, she gets engineering, but human attraction? Viv kissing Riri short-circuits her brain so badly, she's unable to actually talk to Viv about anything going on, which just turns this into a will they won't they narrative. That's interesting and awkward and indicative of what it means to be a teenager, not knowing how to compute around people. It's great, because Viv and Riri are teenagers, and it's at the era in your life where everything is awkward, where nothing really makes sense, everything's uncomfortable, and by exploring the age of the characters as a conflict, it makes the character so much more interesting. Now, Ironheart doesn't return Viv's affections, mind you, but her inability to actually process what happened is a perfect little character beat, because it forces Riri into a position where her skills are completely useless. And I love that. I love how the Champions takes this character who's defined by her skills and says, you know what? Let's just take her and put her into a really strange scenario she's not equipped to deal with and just see what happens. Bendis refused to ever do that, keeping the character firmly in her comfort zone and nowhere else. And it's amazing how a more talented writer can just do something so great with the character when exploring what goes beyond just engineering and programming. And it's a concept that continues into the Ewing run, where Riri creates an AI of the best friend who was killed by the drive-by shooter, and it adds this emotional sentimentality to her programming, using her skills to bring back something that she lost, even in a small way. It gives an emotional perspective to Ironheart's behavior and actions. Now, I don't feel the need to go into every appearance of Ironheart because I basically discussed over half of it just now. The popularity of Riri was deeply affected by Bendis' introduction, and as a result, people just didn't really know what to use with her too often. They put her in team books, and she had her own run with Ewing, but it became harder and harder to make her a central character because Bendis really screwed up in that first run. Bendis did such a terrible job setting up Ironheart as a character that no one knew what to do with her outside of reinventing the whole character, which, you know, is a risk. Starting a solo book about a character who's already unpopular, that's a challenge. It's easier to put her on a team and see how she functions in that dynamic. But as the other members of the team got more and more popular, like Miles Morales and Kamala Khan, she was pushed further and further back into the back ends of the comics, and sadly, kind of in a memory hole of sorts now. She barely shows up. In the last 5 years, she's appeared less often than in the first 3 when she was first introduced. But ultimately, we've come to the MCU. Ironheart was established without a core cast, slotted into Black Panther Wakanda Forever as a teen genius whose talents were exploited by a government body. Gone is Riri's antisocial behavior. In its place, an affable young woman from MIT who casually takes apart cars and builds Iron Man armors appears. But here, rather than being an Iron Man Jr. like a certain other young hero in the MCU, Riri is a peer of Shuri, another young genius character. So she offers this interesting dynamic with another character who speaks her language, so to speak. Ironically, in the far more politically minded Wakanda Forever, there are no moments where Riri just stops and turns the camera to espouse her political ideology. Rather, said anti-colonialist, anti-capitalist themes are exposed organically through the story by showing the CIA and other countries stealing her tech and the tech from other MIT students in order to fuel their hunt for vibranium in the oceans. Oh, and on the show What If, she fights Mysterio, which I think is an interesting component, how Riri is still tangled up in Spider-Man's story in the MCU, but also fighting people who have a grudge against Tony Stark in the MCU, which I guess ties it all up together. I would argue that in the generally underwhelming Season 3 of What If, her episode is probably the most compelling as a narrative. In terms of her solo series Ironheart, which is not out as of this recording, I think it looks good. It could be good. It could be bad. Hey, it can go either way. I like the idea, though, of Riri's drive to succeed at all cost, being used as a vice by a villain, like the Hood. Stealing in the comics is always justified as a means to get more tech or complete her work, and no one ever questions the ethos of it, but it looks like the show will. And also, mixing in technology with magic, I always dig that. I think it's really cool. I think that any story that crosses magic and tech and sci-fi is interesting and a neat idea. Also, apparently, Eric Andre's in this. I don't know what that implies, but I'm interested.
I did not get the job at Fruit Loops. My body is now your communion. Please eat from me.
Yet the way people talk about this show online, I feel like we're watching trailers for different shows.
In less than 3 minutes, the air in this elevator will no longer be breathable.
Must have been taco night, I guess. It's okay though, Riri's got a highly technical solution.
Screw this.
Fuck.
I heard Riri Williams was a genius.
Aye, it takes a real genius to force an elevator door open.
Wait, why'd you bypass the shot where she's seen bypassing the circuitry of the elevator to open the door up? Why would you just act like it was something different than it really was? I feel like you're cutting out some details to make your agenda here, but okay. Like, sure, Does it look amazing? Not really. It probably won't be as good as Agatha All Along, which I thought was really good and surprising. It will probably lead into a tease for Kamala Khan's team of heroes that we saw she's forming at the end of the Marvels, sure, but this still is more compelling than anything Bendis wrote for Riri in the first place. Crossing Riri with the Hood and creating a personal conflict between them elevates the show so much further beyond what Bendis did originally, which was one of the worst ways to introduce a character possibly. Period. Bar none. At all. And yet hearing people talk with this trailer, again, I am not surprised, because it's the landscape of media criticism now. Watch a trailer, act like you know the whole movie. Yeah, sure, that's the name of the game. The MCU version of Riri, though, doesn't have any of the problems that comic version of Ironheart had. And Black Panther 2, controversial opinion, I thought it was pretty good. Pretty damn good film, considering the circumstances behind its making. Now, did Ironheart feel tangential to the plot compared to Namor? Yeah, sure, but I thought she was a decent character who didn't steal the spotlight from the rest of the cast. Here, Ironheart's not replacing Tony Stark. She's her own hero. There's so many people in Iron Man suits in the MCU, like what's the 6th, 7th one if you count Spider-Man? There's so many that show up. So it's not like Ironheart's particularly unique in that sense. She's one of a many. Yet, I don't want to say also people who just criticize Riri are racist, because there are actual flaws at place here. Many I've pointed out. Look, whatever happens with the show, it's going to be better than the source material, because Bendis' run on Ironheart, on the Invincible Iron Man introduced Ironheart as a character, is terrible. Multiple comic book writers tried to fix this character and succeeded, but it wasn't enough for the mainstream audiences because they had stopped looking for her. If they saw it, they were already interested in comics already, so no need to get the audience more. They couldn't draw in a new audience, and even then, she only had a fraction of the audience reading. And it stinks. It's proof that a terrible setup can ruin a character, and that it may poison the well for further chances to improve the character. Because even then, no matter what the Champions and Ewing were doing, you were still building on a flawed foundation established by Bendis. When it comes to character introductions, you only get one shot. You get one chance to introduce a character. And if you fail, if you flub, then it does not matter what you do from there on. You're building on a foundation that's cracked, and you better have a good way of fixing it. To really reinvent the character in a way that's compelling and different, because otherwise all you get is disappointment.
Good morning, America. New studio. God, looks great. Miss Thorne, I couldn't be happier than to be seeing you bring Riri Williams to life. Anyway, I don't want to step on your interview. Long story short, Iron Man loves Ironheart.
That's so crazy.